The chamber was tense, the air thick with the hum of cameras and the restless shifting of bodies in leather chairs. Then, with the precision of a man who'd been sharpening his blade all morning, Mike Pompeo leaned forward, voice low but cutting enough to slice through the murmurs. "Congresswoman Crockett," he said, pausing just long enough for the silence to lean in, "your so-called record is nothing more than a string of empty gestures, a resume padded with symbolism, not substance." A ripple moved through the room. It wasn't just the words, it was the way he said them, dripping with the kind of condescension that assumes the target will shrink. Somewhere in the back, a staffer's pen stopped mid-scribble. A cough was stifled. And then came the audible gasp, sharp and collective, as if the entire chamber had been slapped. The camera found her instantly. Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. Her gaze locked on him, steady and unblinking, the faintest curve of a knowing smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. No papers shuffled in her hands, no nervous glance to an aide, just stillness, the kind that makes the other side wonder if they've just made a mistake. In a room full of power, the narrator's voice would later echo over the footage. One voice refused to bow. Outside these walls, the moment was already escaping into the wild. A clip hit Twitter within seconds, the caption blazing, "Did Pompeo just go too far?" Instagram stories lit up with freeze frames of Crockett's expression, tagged with fire emojis and the words "wait for it." Cable news producers were already flagging the exchange for the evening rundown. Headlines began to form in real time. Pompeo strikes, but Crockett holds the line. Comment threads swelled with outrage, admiration, and the electric anticipation of a comeback. Back in the chamber, the seconds stretched. Pompeo leaned back, certain he'd landed the blow. Crockett's eyes never left his. Somewhere, a camera light blinked red, recording every heartbeat of the silence. And then, just as the tension reached its breaking point, the narrator's voice returned, low and deliberate. But what she said next, no one in Washington saw coming. The hearing was never meant to be routine. In a Congress fractured along deep ideological lines, every public exchange had the potential to become a proxy war for the nation's soul. The cameras weren't just there to record testimony. They were there to capture moments, the kind that could be clipped, captioned, and shared until they became part of the political bloodstream. Mike Pompeo entered this arena with the weight of a long career behind him. Former cabinet member, seasoned diplomat, and a man who had navigated the highest corridors of power, he carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to controlling the narrative. His words could command headlines. His presence could shift the tone of a room. For years, he had been the one asking the questions, setting the traps, and watching opponents stumble. Across from him sat Jasmine Crockett, newer to the national stage, but far from untested. Her rise had been swift, propelled by a combination of sharp intellect, unapologetic authenticity, and a refusal to let her identity be weaponized against her. To her supporters, she was more than a representative. She was proof that the halls of power could be breached by those who had once been told they didn't belong. The stakes of this hearing went beyond policy. It was a collision of two political archetypes, the entrenched power broker versus the insurgent truth-teller. For Pompeo, undermining Crockett's credibility wasn't just about winning an argument. It was about reinforcing the old order. For Crockett, holding her ground meant defending not only her record, but the legitimacy of every voice like hers that had fought to be heard. The political climate outside these walls was volatile. Social media had become the new battlefield, where perception often mattered more than fact. A single exchange could ignite a movement or end a career. The public was hungry for authenticity, for moments that felt unscripted and real. And in that hunger lay the danger and the opportunity. Pompeo's attack had been calculated, designed to plant doubt in the minds of viewers before Crockett could even respond. But in doing so, he had set the stage for something he couldn't control. The room could feel it, the shift in energy, the quiet anticipation. This wasn't going to be a polite back and forth. This was going to be a test of composure, of moral clarity, of who could own the moment when the spotlight burned hottest. Somewhere in the press gallery, a reporter's fingers hovered over a keyboard, ready to capture the instant the tide turned. In the digital age, the first to post often defined the narrative, and this was a narrative begging to be written. Crockett's silence after the attack wasn't hesitation, it was strategy. Every second she held the pause, the tension grew. Every heartbeat without a reply made the audience lean in closer. She knew the cameras were on her. She knew the clip would be replayed. And she knew that when she finally spoke, it had to be more than a rebuttal. It had to be a statement. Outside, the world was already watching. Notifications pinged, group chats lit up, and hashtags began to form in the minds of those who had seen the first clip. They didn't yet know what she would say, but they knew they wanted to be there when she said it. And yet, this was only the beginning of a clash that would ripple far beyond these walls. Mike Pompeo's career had been forged in the crucible of American power politics, and he wore that history like a tailored suit. From his early days at West Point, where discipline and hierarchy were the currency of respect, to his tenure as a congressman and later as a cabinet official, Pompeo had cultivated an image of the consummate insider, a man who knew the rules because he had helped write them. He was, to his allies, a master tactician, sharp, unflappable, and relentlessly strategic. To his critics, he was something else entirely, a political operator whose confidence often bled into condescension, whose certainty in his own judgment left little room for dissent. In hearing rooms and press briefings, he had a way of leaning back in his chair, folding his arms, and delivering his words with the slow precision of someone who believed the conversation was already over before it began. His rise had been marked by moments that showcased both his skill and his sharp edges. As Secretary of State, he had navigated high-stakes negotiations with the kind of steely composure that made headlines. But those same headlines often carried the subtext of controversy, accusations of sidestepping transparency, dismissing inconvenient questions, or framing critics as naive or unpatriotic. In interviews, he could pivot from charm to challenge in a heartbeat, leaving opponents scrambling to recover. There was a pattern to his confrontations. He would begin with a veneer of civility, a polite nod to the decorum of the setting. Then, almost imperceptibly, the tone would shift, a raised eyebrow here, a clipped phrase there, until the exchange became less about the issue at hand and more about establishing dominance. Those who faltered under that pressure often found themselves reduced to sound bites that reinforced his narrative. In political circles, this was seen as part of his brand. He was the man who could walk into a room, dismantle an argument, and walk out without a hair out of place. It was a style that played well with those who valued strength as the ultimate political currency. But it also carried the unmistakable air of elitism, the sense that he was not merely debating ideas, but reminding everyone of his place in the hierarchy. Over the years, this approach had earned him both loyalty and resentment. Supporters admired his refusal to yield ground, interpreting it as conviction. Detractors saw it as arrogance, a refusal to engage with perspectives that didn't align with his own. In hearings, he had been known to cut off questioners mid-sentence, to smirk at lines of inquiry he deemed unserious, and to pivot away from uncomfortable truths with the ease of a man who had been dodging political traps his entire career. The attack on Jasmine Crockett fit neatly into this pattern. To him, it was a familiar play. Identify a perceived vulnerability, frame it as a fatal flaw, and deliver the critique with enough authority to make it sound definitive. It was the kind of move that had left others flustered, scrambling to defend themselves while he controlled the tempo of the exchange. But what Pompeo could not see, or perhaps underestimated, was that Crockett was not entering this moment unprepared. Her career had been built on navigating spaces where she was underestimated, on turning dismissiveness into an opening rather than a dead end. The very qualities he sought to undermine were the ones that had carried her into this room, and they were about to serve her well. Still, in that moment, the balance of power seemed to tilt his way. His words hung in the air, reinforced by the weight of his resume and the authority of his delivery. The room had seen this before, the seasoned statesman delivering the put-down, the opponent shrinking under the glare. It was a script Pompeo had performed many times, and it had rarely failed him. He leaned back slightly, the faintest trace of satisfaction crossing his face. Around him, the atmosphere shifted, some in the chamber nodding in agreement, others bristling but silent. For years, this had been his arena. He had faced journalists, lawmakers, and foreign dignitaries, and more often than not, he had walked away with the upper hand. His confidence was not unfounded. It was built on a track record of bending moments to his will. But history has a way of setting the stage for its own reversals. And in this room, on this day, the familiar script was about to be rewritten. Because the man who had silenced so many before was about to meet his match. Jasmine Crockett's story did not begin in the marble corridors of Washington, but in a neighborhood where the sound of ambition was often drowned out by the noise of survival. She grew up in a working-class family that measured wealth not in dollars, but in the strength of their bonds and the depth of their values. Her parents taught her early that dignity was not something granted by others. It was something you carried, even when the world tried to strip it away. As a child, she learned to navigate spaces that were not built for her. In classrooms where expectations were low, she pushed herself higher. In community meetings where voices like hers were often ignored, she learned to speak louder, not in volume but in conviction. She saw how power operated, how decisions made far away could shape the streets she walked every day, and she began to understand that the fight for fairness was not abstract. It was personal. Her path to public service was not a straight line. Before she ever held office, she was an advocate first for herself, then for others. She worked jobs that demanded more grit than glamour, balancing bills with dreams, refusing to let either define her entirely. Law school was not a given. It was a battle. She studied late into the night, fueled by the belief that the law could be more than a weapon for the powerful. It could be a shield for the vulnerable. When she became a public defender, she stepped into courtrooms where the odds were stacked against her clients before the first word was spoken. She saw the weight of systemic bias, the quiet ways dignity was eroded, and she fought back with every tool she had. Each case was more than a file. It was a life, a family, a future. And with every victory and every loss, she sharpened her resolve. Her work in the community was just as relentless. She organized voter registration drives, mentored young women who had been told their voices didn't matter, and stood alongside neighbors in protests that demanded change. She didn't just talk about representation, she embodied it. People saw in her someone who understood their struggles because she had lived them. When she ran for office, it wasn't on the promise of being perfect. It was on the promise of being present, of showing up, listening and fighting with the same tenacity she had carried her whole life. Her campaign was powered less by big donors and more by small contributions from people who believed in her. They weren't just electing a representative. They were sending one of their own into the halls of power. In Congress, she carried herself with the same grounded confidence she had in the courtroom. She knew the stakes of every vote, every hearing, every exchange. She understood that for many watching, she wasn't just speaking for herself. She was speaking for communities that had been sidelined, for identities that had been dismissed, for truths that had been buried under political spin. Her moral clarity was not performative. It came from years of seeing what happens when leaders forget who they serve. She refused to be intimidated by titles or seniority. She had faced down prosecutors who underestimated her, judges who doubted her, and systems designed to keep her quiet. A sharp remark from a political heavyweight was not going to shake her. And yet, she was not hardened into cynicism. She still believed in the possibility of change, in the idea that politics could be a force for good if wielded with integrity. That belief was her armor and her weapon. The day she sat across from Mike Pompeo, she carried all of this with her. Every late night in law school, every courtroom battle, every community meeting where she had to fight to be heard, It was all there, woven into the calm in her eyes and the steadiness in her voice. She knew what it was to be underestimated. She knew what it was to be challenged by someone who assumed their power was unshakable. And she knew that the most devastating replies were not shouted, but delivered with precision and purpose. The people who had supported her from the beginning were watching. So were those who had doubted her. And somewhere, in living rooms and on phone screens across the country, young women who looked like her were leaning forward, waiting to see how she would respond. She had been here before, not in this exact room, not with this exact opponent, but in moments where the balance of power seemed tilted against her. And every time, she had found a way to tilt it back. And it was those very battles that prepared her for the moment of truth. The air in the chamber had shifted. What began as a formal hearing was now teetering on the edge of open confrontation. Pompeo's voice, once measured and deliberate, had taken on a sharper edge. Each question was less an inquiry and more an accusation, his phrasing designed to box Crockett into a corner. He leaned forward with the confidence of a man who believed he was tightening the noose. Crockett, however, did not mirror his energy. Her responses were calm, deliberate, and precise, the kind of composure that can be more unnerving than anger. She didn't rush to fill the silences he left hanging. She let them sit, forcing the weight of his words to linger in the air. The contrast between them was stark. Pompeo's clipped delivery against her steady cadence, his jabs against her unshaken poise. Around them, the room was alive with subtle signals. Aides shifted in their seats, exchanging glances that betrayed both concern and curiosity. Some lawmakers leaned in, sensing the moment was building toward something bigger. Others sat back, arms crossed, as if bracing for impact. The press gallery was a sea of poised pens and glowing screens, every reporter aware that they might be witnessing the birth of a headline. Pompeo pressed harder. He began layering his critiques, moving from her legislative record to her public statements, each point delivered with the precision of someone who had rehearsed the blows. His tone carried the faintest trace of mockery, the kind that invites the audience to share in the dismissal. He was no longer just challenging her policies, he was questioning her legitimacy. Crockett met each point with the same measured restraint. She didn't flinch when he interrupted. She didn't raise her voice when he implied she was out of her depth. Instead, she answered with facts, context, and a quiet confidence that suggested she was not here to win his approval. Every so often, she would pause just long enough to make him wonder if she was finished, and then deliver a final line that landed with more force than any raised voice could. The tension was palpable. Even those who had entered the room indifferent to the exchange were now leaning forward, drawn in by the rhythm of the back and forth. It was no longer just a hearing. It was a duel fought not with swords but with words, posture, and presence. Pompeo's frustration began to show in small ways, a tighter grip on his pen, a slight narrowing of the eyes, a quicker pace in his delivery. He was used to opponents stumbling under sustained pressure, but Crockett was giving him nothing. Her calm was not passive, it was strategic, a refusal to let him dictate the terms of the encounter. The murmurs in the room grew louder with each exchange. A few heads turned toward colleagues, silently asking, "Are you seeing this?" The energy was shifting, and everyone could feel it. What had started as Pompeo's offensive was beginning to feel like a prelude to something else, something he might not be able to control. Crockett's eyes never left his. She listened as he delivered yet another pointed critique, her expression unreadable. When she did respond, it was with the same unhurried precision, as though she were dismantling his arguments piece by piece, brick by brick. She wasn't just defending herself, she was setting the stage. By now, the hearing had the attention of more than just those in the room. Clips of the earlier exchange were already circulating online, fueling speculation about what might happen next. Viewers at home were tuning in midstream, drawn by the promise of a confrontation that felt both personal and symbolic. Pompeo, perhaps sensing the eyes of the nation on him, delivered one final, barbed remark, a line meant to seal his dominance in the moment. The words hung in the air, daring her to respond. Crockett inhaled slowly, her gaze steady, her posture unshaken. The room seemed to hold its breath. Then, with the nation watching, she struck. For a moment the room was still. Pompeo's last barb hung in the air like smoke after a gunshot, curling into every corner of the chamber. All eyes were on Jasmine Crockett. She didn't move right away. She let the silence stretch, let the weight of his words settle just enough for everyone to feel their sting. Then, with a slow inhale, she leaned forward. "Mr. Pompeo," she began, her voice steady, almost conversational, "I appreciate your concern for my record, truly. But since you've brought it up, let's talk about records." The first beat landed softly, not a counterpunch, but the opening of a door. She glanced briefly at her notes, then back at him, locking eyes as if to say, "I'm not here to dodge." "You've had a long career," she continued, "and I respect anyone who serves this country. But service isn't just about holding." A murmur rippled through the room. Pompeo shifted slightly in his chair, his pen tapping once against the table. "My record," she said, "isn't padded with symbolism. It's built on showing up in courtrooms where no cameras were rolling, in neighborhoods where no one was taking notes, in communities that didn't have a lobbyist to speak for them. I've fought for people who couldn't afford to hire someone like you to care about their problems." The second beat hit harder. A few heads turned toward Pompeo. He didn't look away, but his jaw tightened. "And since we're talking about substance," she went on, "let's remember that substance isn't measured by how many times you've been in the headlines. It's measured by how many lives you've changed for the better. I didn't come to Congress to collect photo ops. I came here to make sure the people who sent me here, the ones who work two jobs, the ones who have been told their voices don't matter, finally have someone who will fight for them without asking what they can give in return." Gasps now, quiet but audible. The energy in the room was shifting. She paused, letting the words breathe. Then came the third beat, the pivot. "You've accused me of empty gestures, but I've read your record too. And I've seen moments where you had the chance to stand up for truth, for transparency, for the people, and instead you chose to protect power. That's not service. That's self-preservation." Pompeo's pen stopped tapping. His gaze flickered, just for a second, toward the cameras. Crockett leaned in slightly, her tone still calm but now edged with steel. "You see, I don't measure my worth by how many rooms I've commanded. I measure it by how many people I've lifted. And if that makes my record look different from yours, I'll take that as a compliment." The fourth beat landed like a hammer. A low hum of reaction swept through the chamber, not loud enough to break decorum, but impossible to ignore. She didn't stop there. "You've built a career on telling people what they want to hear, on making sure you're always on the winning side of the room. I've built mine on telling people what they need to hear, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it costs me. Because leadership isn't about comfort, it's about courage." Pompeo's posture stiffened. He opened his mouth slightly, as if to interject, but she was already moving to the fifth beat. "And here's the thing about courage," she said, her voice dropping just enough to make the room lean in. "It's not loud. It's not flashy. It's not about cutting someone down to prove you're taller. Courage is standing your ground when the easy thing would be to step aside. Courage is knowing that the people who sent you here are counting on you to speak, even when the person across from you would rather you stayed silent." The silence that followed was different now. It wasn't the tense pause after an attack. It was the stillness that comes when everyone knows the tide has turned. Crockett straightened, her eyes never leaving his. "So if you want to talk about records, Mr. Pompeo, let's talk about the record we're setting right now. You tried to question my legitimacy. You tried to frame my service as hollow. But all you've done is remind the people watching why I'm here and why I'm not going anywhere." A sharp intake of breath from somewhere in the gallery. Pompeo's lips pressed into a thin line. She delivered the final beat with the precision of a closing argument. Because at the end of the day, history doesn't remember the ones who spoke the loudest. It remembers the ones who stood the firmest. And I will always stand firm for my district, for my values, and for the truth. The room erupted not in applause, but in that electric, wordless reaction that says something just happened. Aides exchanged wide-eyed glances. Reporters' fingers flew across keyboards. Somewhere, a camera zoomed in on Pompeo's face, capturing the moment he realized there was nothing left to say. He sat back silent. Crockett didn't gloat. She didn't smirk. She simply gathered her papers, the faintest trace of a smile playing at her lips, and waited for the chair to move on. But the real explosion was still to come, and it wouldn't happen in that room. The moment the gavel struck to move the hearing forward, the real battle began not in the chamber, but in the boundless, unfiltered arena of the internet. Within minutes, the clip of Jasmine Crockett's takedown was everywhere. The freeze frame of her leaning forward, eyes locked on Pompeo, had already become a meme template. Someone overlaid the words, "Say it louder for the people in the back," in bold white text. Another paired it with a slow-motion replay set to swelling orchestral music. On Twitter, the hashtag #CrockettClapback shot to the top of the trending list, flanked by Stand With Jasmine and Mic Drop Moment. Activists, journalists, and everyday viewers flooded the feed with reactions. "This is how you handle arrogance," one post read, racking up thousands of retweets in under an hour. A viral thread broke down her counterattack point by point, framing it as a masterclass in composure under fire. Instagram lit up with short reels of the exchange, each one edited with captions for maximum impact. TikTok creators stitched the clip into reaction videos, some gasping mid-sentence, others nodding in approval as if they were right there in the room. One popular creator simply stared into the camera for the duration of Crockett's speech, then whispered, "That's how it's done," before cutting to black. By the afternoon, celebrity voices had joined the chorus. A Grammy-winning singer tweeted, "Jasmine Crockett just reminded us what leadership looks like." A well-known actor posted the clip on Instagram with the caption, "This is the energy we need in every room where decisions are made." Even a retired athlete, famous for his own fiery comebacks, weighed in. That's a championship performance right there. Cable news seized on the moment. Every major network replayed the exchange, some looping it with dramatic slow-motion cuts, others pairing it with split-screen reactions from political commentators. On one panel, a progressive strategist called it the most effective dismantling of a political attack we've seen this year. On another, a conservative pundit tried to downplay it as overblown theatrics, but the smirk on his face suggested he knew the damage had been done. Editorials began to appear online before the day was over. Headlines ranged from "Crockett redefines the congressional clapback" to "Pompeo meets his match." Opinion writers dissected the exchange as a cultural moment, not just a political one, a collision of old guard authority and new wave authenticity. For Crockett's supporters, the moment was galvanizing. Grassroots organizers reported a surge in volunteer signups. Small dollar donations spiked, accompanied by notes from contributors saying they wanted to fuel more moments like this. Community leaders in her district spoke to local reporters about the pride they felt seeing someone from their neighborhood stand toe-to-toe with a political heavyweight and not blink. Her critics scrambled to reframe the narrative. Some tried to paint her as disrespectful, others as overly rehearsed. But the footage itself, raw, unedited, and replayed millions of times, undercut those attempts. The calm in her delivery, the precision of her points, the visible shift in Pompeo's demeanor, it was all there, undeniable. By evening, the moment had crossed into late-night comedy. A popular host opened his monologue with the clip, pausing halfway through to sip from a mug and say, "I'm sorry, I just need a minute to enjoy this again." The audience roared. In the days that followed, the ripple effects continued. Political podcasts devoted entire episodes to analyzing the exchange. College debate teams used it as a case study in rhetorical strategy. A civics teacher in California posted a video of her students watching the clip in class, their cheers echoing through the room. But beyond the noise, something deeper was happening. For many viewers, especially young women, immigrants, and people of color, the moment was more than entertainment. It was validation. It was proof that you could walk into a room designed to diminish you, face down someone who had spent a career commanding it, and not just survive, but own it. And yet, beyond the noise, a deeper truth was taking root. When the noise of the chamber faded and the headlines began to blur, what remained was not just the memory of a sharp exchange, but the clarity of what it meant. Jasmine Crockett had not simply defended herself. She had reframed the entire confrontation into something larger, something that reached beyond the walls of Congress and into the lives of those watching. In interviews afterward, she didn't dwell on Pompeo's words. She didn't replay the insult or the tension. Instead, she spoke about the principle at stake, that dignity is not a luxury reserved for the powerful, but a right that belongs to everyone. We can disagree on policy, she said, but we cannot afford to normalize disrespect. Not here, not anywhere. Her message was simple, but it carried the weight of lived experience. She reminded the public that service is not about ego or about winning the loudest argument in the room. It is about showing up for people who may never know your name, but whose lives are shaped by the decisions you make. It is about resisting the temptation to use power as a weapon, and instead using it as a shield for those who have none. The narrator's voice, in the retelling, wove her words into a broader tapestry. This was not just a story about one lawmaker standing her ground. It was about every teacher who refuses to give up on a student others have written off, every nurse who speaks up for a patient when the system tries to rush them through, every community leader who keeps organizing even when the cameras are gone. It was about the quiet, daily acts of courage that rarely trend on social media but form the backbone of justice. Crockett's stand was a reminder that representation is not symbolic, it is functional. It changes the questions that get asked, the priorities that get set, the tone that is deemed acceptable in the rooms where decisions are made. Her words resonated because they were not abstract. They were rooted in the reality that many watching understood all too well, the experience of being underestimated, dismissed, or spoken over. She turned that shared experience into a rallying point, not by stoking resentment, but by affirming worth. And in doing so, she offered a vision of politics that was not about crushing an opponent, but about elevating a standard. She showed that you can dismantle an attack without becoming what you oppose, that you can win a moment without losing your moral compass. The footage of her reply continued to circulate, but now it was often paired with her follow-up remarks, the ones that distilled the confrontation into a universal truth. Dignity over hate, she said in one interview. Service over ego. That's the choice we face every day in every role we hold, and it's the choice I'll keep making. For those who had cheered her in the moment, this was the deeper payoff. The mic drop had been satisfying, but the moral clarity was sustaining. It gave the moment a life beyond the news cycle, turning it into a touchstone for conversations about leadership, respect, and the kind of country people wanted to live in. In living rooms, classrooms, and community centers, the clip was replayed not just for its drama, but for its lesson. Parents showed it to their children as an example of standing firm without losing grace. Activists cited it in speeches about why representation matters. Even some who disagreed with her politics admitted, quietly, that there was something admirable in the way she had handled herself. The narrator's voice in the final retelling brought it home. In a time when shouting often drowns out listening, when ego too often masquerades as strength, one voice reminded us that true power is measured not by how many you can silence, but by how many you can lift. The image of her in that moment, calm, unshaken, resolute, became more than a political memory. It became a symbol of what is possible when courage meets clarity, when conviction is paired with compassion. Because in the end, this wasn't just her victory, it was ours. In the end, the moment that began with an attack meant to diminish her became the very proof of why Jasmine Crockett's voice matters. Mike Pompeo, ATTACKS, Jasmine Crockett's record. Her reply stuns him in silence was more than a headline. It was a snapshot of a truth we rarely see so clearly, that dignity, when held with conviction, can silence arrogance without ever raising its volume. Her stand in that chamber was not just about defending a record. It was about defending the idea that public service is measured by the lives you touch, not the titles you collect. It was about showing that strength is not in the sharpness of your words, but in the steadiness of your principles. And it was about proving that when you speak for those who have been told they don't belong, you carry more power than any insult can take away. This is why moments like this matter. They remind us that politics is not just policy, it's people. It's the courage to face down condescension and still choose grace. It's the belief that truth, spoken plainly, can cut through the noise. If this moment moved you, if it made you feel seen, if it made you believe that integrity still has a place in our public life, then don't let it fade into the scroll of yesterday's news. Share it. Talk about it. Be part of the reason more voices like hers rise to the microphone. Subscribe to stay connected. Share this story so others can feel what you felt. And join the movement for truth, dignity, and leadership that lifts rather than tears down. Because the fight for respect and representation